Picture this. You've just stepped off a creaky wooden ship after months at sea, and you're standing on the edge of an endless wilderness. Just you, a few basic tools, and the very real possibility that winter might kill you if you don't figure out shelter pretty quickly. That was reality for early American colonists, and honestly, what they managed to pull off might just blow your mind. While we're busy complaining about our Wi-Fi being slow, these folks were literally carving civilization out of raw forest with nothing but axes, determination, and what I can only describe as an absolutely terrifying amount of optimism. They didn't just survive, they built homes that some of their descendants are still living in today, over 400 years later. If you're fascinated by how people survived and thrived before modern conveniences, you're going to love what's coming up. Make sure to hit that subscribe button because we dive deep into these incredible survival stories every week. Now here's where things get interesting, and by interesting, I mean absolutely chaotic. Unlike medieval peasants who were basically stuck wherever their lord decided to plop them down, American colonists had something that seems almost magical by comparison: choice. Sort of. The thing is, having choice doesn't necessarily make things easier, it just makes them more complicated in entirely new ways. Take the Jamestown settlers, for example. They had this brilliant idea to build their settlement in what seemed like the perfect spot, a peninsula that would be easy to defend from Spanish attacks. Except, and this is a pretty big except, they'd essentially chosen to build their homes in a malarial swamp. Turns out that strategic military positioning doesn't mean much when half your population is dying from diseases that breed in stagnant water. The Massachusetts Bay colonists learned from these early mistakes, though they probably wish someone had written them a strongly worded Yelp review about Virginia's location choices. They looked for spots with three crucial elements: fresh water that actually flowed, soil that might grow something edible, and timber that wouldn't require a 3-day hiking expedition to collect. But here's what's really fascinating. The colonists didn't just randomly scatter across the landscape like someone had shaken a bag of settlers and let them fall where they may. They developed this surprisingly sophisticated system of land distribution that would make modern city planners take notes. In New England, they created what they called town grants. Basically, a group of families would petition the colonial government for a chunk of land, usually about 6 miles square. That's roughly 23,000 acres, which sounds massive until you realize it had to support an entire community. The town would then divide this land among families based on their wealth, family size, and how useful their skills might be to the community. The really clever part? They didn't just give everyone random plots. They created a system where each family got several different pieces of land. Maybe some fertile soil near the river for crops, some upland for grazing animals, and some woodland for building materials and fuel. It was like a medieval version of diversifying your investment portfolio, except instead of stocks and bonds, you were diversifying dirt and trees. Southern colonies took a completely different approach that was, frankly, a bit more chaotic. Virginia's headright system gave 50 acres to anyone who paid their own way to America, plus an additional 50 acres for every person whose passage they sponsored. This led to some pretty creative interpretations of sponsorship, and probably the first instances of American real estate speculation. The result was a patchwork of settlements that ranged from carefully planned communities to what can only be described as wherever seemed good at, the time homesteads scattered across the wilderness. Now, if you think finding the right spot was challenging, wait until you hear about the tools situation, or rather the complete lack of tools situation. Most colonists arrived in America with what they could carry, which wasn't much. We're talking about people who had sold everything they owned just to afford passage on a ship that might or might not actually make it across the Atlantic. The idea of packing a full workshop was about as realistic as packing a hot tub. The typical colonist might have brought an axe, if they were lucky, a knife, maybe a hammer, and possibly a saw if they were among the more prosperous settlers. That's it. That's the entire tool collection for building a house from scratch in the wilderness. Compare this to medieval peasants who at least had access to village blacksmiths and could borrow tools from neighbors who'd been using the same techniques for generations. American colonists were basically trying to reinvent construction from first principles, while also figuring out how to not starve or get eaten by bears. The axe became the Swiss Army knife of colonial construction. It wasn't just for chopping down trees, though it certainly did plenty of that. Colonists used axes for shaping logs, cutting joints, splitting shingles, and probably opening stubborn food containers. Archaeological evidence from early colonial sites shows axe marks on everything from foundation stones to wooden spoons. But here's where colonial ingenuity really started to shine. They began making their own tools almost immediately. The first blacksmiths in colonial settlements weren't luxury craftsmen. They were survival necessities. Communities would pool resources to bring over a blacksmith or train someone locally. Because without metal tools, you weren't just building slowly, you were building badly. Iron was so precious that colonists would often dismantle old tools to make new ones. A broken plow might become nails for house construction. Worn-out horseshoes got melted down for hinges. Nothing metal was ever truly discarded. It was just temporarily between useful forms. The tool shortage led to some pretty creative solutions. Colonists learned to make wooden mallets that could drive wooden pegs. They carved wooden planes for smoothing lumber. They even figured out how to make surprisingly effective saws by hammering and filing old metal strips. One particularly clever innovation was the froe, a tool for splitting wooden shingles that colonists developed specifically for American conditions. It was basically a large, flat blade with a handle perpendicular to the cutting edge. You'd place it on a piece of wood and hit it with a wooden mallet to split off thin, flat pieces perfect for roofing. With tools sorted out, or at least improvised, colonists faced their next challenge, finding the right trees. And let me tell you, not all trees are created equal when it comes to house building. The good news was that America had forests that made European woodlands look like suburban parks. We're talking about old-growth forests with trees so massive that a single oak could provide enough lumber for an entire house frame. Some of these trees were 200, 300, even 400 years old, which meant they were incredibly dense and strong. The bad news was that these forests were also home to wolves, bears, hostile Native American tribes, and the occasional mountain lion who didn't appreciate uninvited guests chopping down the neighborhood. Colonial builders quickly learned that different trees served different purposes, and choosing the wrong wood could mean the difference between a house that lasted generations and one that collapsed before you finished building it. Oak became the gold standard for house frames. It was incredibly strong, resistant to rot, and could be shaped while green but would harden as it dried. The problem with oak was that it was also incredibly heavy and difficult to work with. Cutting down a mature oak was a multi-day project that required several men and probably resulted in more than a few colorful expressions that wouldn't make it into church sermons. Pine was easier to work with and grew faster, making it perfect for boards and planking. But pine had its own challenges. It was softer, more prone to insect damage, and if you weren't careful about how you dried it, it would warp and twist like it was trying to escape from your house. Chestnut was the secret weapon of colonial construction. It was naturally rot-resistant, split easily, and grew straight and tall. American chestnut trees could reach 100 feet in height and 10 feet in diameter. The process of selecting and harvesting timber was surprisingly scientific for people who were basically making it up as they went along. Colonists learned to cut trees in winter when the sap was down, which made the wood less likely to crack and split as it dried. They also figured out that trees cut during certain phases of the moon, and yes, they actually paid attention to this, seemed to last longer, though modern science suggests this might have been more about seasonal timing than lunar influence. Transportation was another massive challenge. A single large oak log could weigh several tons, and colonial America wasn't exactly known for its excellent road system. Most timber had to be dragged to the building site using oxen or horses, which meant that the location of good trees often determined where houses could be built. Some clever colonists figured out how to use rivers and streams to float logs to their building sites. This worked great if you happened to live near water that flowed in the right direction. If not, you were back to the oxen drag method, which was about as efficient as it sounds. Here's where colonial house building gets really interesting and surprisingly heartwarming. Unlike the rugged individualism we often associate with early America, house construction was actually a massive community effort that brought entire settlements together. The barn raising, or house raising, depending on what was being built, became one of the most important social events in colonial communities. And I'm not talking about a casual, hey, can you help me move this weekend kind of thing. These were elaborate, multi-day events that involved entire communities and required the kind of coordination that would impress modern event planners. The process typically started weeks in advance. The family building the house would spend months preparing materials, cutting and shaping timbers, gathering stones for the foundation, splitting shingles for the roof. But the actual assembly of the frame happened in a single day with help from everyone in the community. On raising day, which was usually scheduled for late spring or early summer when weather was most cooperative, families would arrive at dawn with their tools and their appetites. The women would set up massive outdoor kitchens to feed what might be 50 to 100 people throughout the day. We're talking about feasts that included roasted meats, fresh bread, vegetables from early gardens, and probably enough ale to make the heavy lifting seem less daunting. The men would organize into teams based on their skills and experience. The most experienced builders would handle the complex joinery and make sure everything fit together properly. Younger men provided the muscle for lifting heavy timbers. Even children had jobs, running tools back and forth, holding pieces in place, and generally trying not to get stepped on by adults carrying massive wooden beams. The actual raising was a carefully choreographed dance. Teams would assemble wall sections on the ground, complete with all the complex joints and connections. Then, using ropes, poles, and sheer human power, they would lift these sections into place. The moment when the main frame stood complete was cause for celebration, and probably relief that nobody had been crushed by falling timber. But here's what made the system really work. It was reciprocal. If you helped raise your neighbor's house, you could count on the entire community showing up when it was your turn to build. It was like a social insurance policy backed by sweat equity instead of money. The community aspect also served as quality control. With dozens of experienced builders involved, mistakes were caught early and fixed immediately. Nobody wanted their name associated with a house that fell down, so everyone had an incentive to do their best work. These raising events also served important social functions beyond just construction. They were opportunities for young people to meet potential spouses, for families to strengthen community bonds, and for the sharing of news and information in an era before mass communication. The techniques developed by colonial builders didn't just disappear when more modern construction methods became available. Many of these innovations continued to influence American architecture for centuries, and some are still used today. The timber frame construction techniques perfected by colonial builders became the foundation for later American building styles. The balloon frame construction that dominated American house building in the 19th century was a direct descendant of colonial timber framing, adapted for mass production and standardized lumber. Colonial roofing techniques also had lasting influence. The wooden shingle roofs developed by colonial builders remained popular in many parts of America well into the 20th century. Even today, cedar shingle roofs are considered premium roofing materials that can last 50 years or more with proper maintenance. Perhaps most importantly, colonial builders established a tradition of innovation and adaptation that became a hallmark of American construction. When faced with new challenges, whether it was extreme weather, unfamiliar materials, or the need to build quickly and efficiently, American builders learned to experiment, adapt, and improve. The community-based approach to construction that characterized colonial barn raisings also had lasting cultural impact. This tradition of neighbors helping neighbors with major construction projects continued well into the 20th century in rural areas and helped establish the cooperative spirit that many consider a fundamental part of American culture. The next time you're frustrated with a home improvement project or complaining about construction delays, take a moment to think about those early American colonists. They managed to create comfortable, durable homes using nothing but hand tools, local materials, and an impressive amount of determination. These weren't just shelters. They were engineering marvels that had to protect families through brutal winters, scorching summers, and everything nature could throw at them. The fact that many of these houses are still standing today, centuries later, is a testament to the skill and ingenuity of their builders. What's really remarkable is how these colonists took European building techniques and adapted them to create something entirely new, construction methods that were perfectly suited to American conditions and materials. They didn't just survive in the New World, they thrived, creating homes that were often more comfortable and durable than what they'd left behind in Europe. The ingenuity of early American colonists goes far beyond just house building. They revolutionized everything from farming techniques to food preservation methods. If you enjoyed learning about colonial construction, be sure to click to subscribe for more incredible stories of human survival and innovation throughout colonial history.